What I love about the UK scene in particular is how varied it is. When I've been in other countries like Germany or France, people would define themselves as slammers as opposed to poets because that's the most recognised format. And within the poetry slam context, there's funny poets, there's serious poets, there's everything in between that. In the UK, what I love is that there is a space for everyone.
I think England tends to be, and I don't mean this badly, it's less music focused, I think. I think in the Scottish scene, just generally poetry is very music influenced and therefore it's quite often very rhythmic. I also think it's a lot more conversational. I don't know if this is so much about slams. But I've participated in a few slams in England and I do think you guys take it a bit too seriously. Like, it's a bit tense, to be honest. Whereas, you know, you go to a Scottish poetry slam and everyone's just kind of like, oh, that was really good. Do you want a drink? It's a lot more casual in nature, I think, whereas you guys kind of big it up a little bit.
Well, I obviously know London. I've been to Edinburgh and seen some poetry slams there. And I have been to America a few times. I think in America it's very dynamic and I don't know, it feels a lot more intimidating. I think London and Edinburgh, the slams I've been in, are very welcoming and I've really enjoyed it.
The biggest exposure I've had to international poetry has been kind of the English language stuff and stuff happening in America or Canada, which has borrowed a lot from the East Coast American style, which I think is quite disappointing because I really want to hear what poetry sounds like on the West Coast. Like, I want to hear what like Vancouver poetry sounds like and that isn't inspired by the American East Coast stuff.
Yeah, I've seen stuff around the country. I make a point of when I visit other places to go to poetry nights. So I've seen stuff in Bristol, just like random open mic nights. I've been to Hit the Ode, which is a night based in Birmingham, but I saw that in Manchester. That was really good. I've been to quite a few poetry nights in Paris, but never a slam. I went to Vancouver recently and I took part in a poetry slam there, and that was really interesting. That was really like cliched slam, like people snapping and it was all kind of emotional manipulation. And I thought actually having developed a bit more of a critical sense of poetry in sort of the last year or so, I mean, it was just terrible. If you printed that on a page, it would just be awful.
What I would say though is that I've met so many spoken word artists, and when you ask them where they first learned to perform, they say YouTube. So I think that with the internet now, you have so many people who are big fans of spoken word and spoken word performers themselves who might not have ever been to a live event, who only learned through watching other performances on YouTube. Kevin Gilday, who's a Glasgow-based performer, has a line in one of his poems. It's called I've Fallen Out of Love with Poetry, and he goes, I've fallen out of love with poetry because you all learned to slam from Americans on YouTube. And I think like it's quite cynical, but it can be true. Often that's where people are getting their information. So as much as there are regional styles, I think sometimes the globalized nature of the internet has made it so that we're actually drawing a lot of our inspiration from the same source in a way. Whether or not that's a problem is one thing, but I would always say like, go to your local events, hear your local poets, like definitely obviously watch YouTube and watch whoever you want, but like there's strength to be found from finding your live local community.
My only brother, my one sibling, he is going to be a policeman. Standing always nearly a foot above me, this boy turned giant whilst becoming a man, always busting grins so wide, cheeks round with the light, laughter that could shake the bad memories out of balls. 2 years ahead in this game from me, but loved so deeply, he is my baby brother.
In terms of like slam styles, I think the styles are really different, and I notice it most in relation to how my work sits there. When I started writing in Australia, I wasn't that aware of an Australian style because that was what I'd experienced. You know, that was what I grew up in the Perth poetry scene. I had only ever heard Perth poems. And then you go on the internet, you start looking at things like button poetry, which largely just film slams. If you really look at what they're filming, it's WAPs, it's Cupsy, it's all these slams, like they mainly film slams. So people talk about button poetry, they're largely talking about slam culture, but they don't really realize it because you only get this very well edited moment. of poetry. And I think when you look at button poetry, you largely see the American style.
The biggest contrast for me that I had, partly because the two were quite close to each other, was I went to the US National Slam finals, again mostly as a spectator. I did one like sacrificial poem, and then I went to the German National Slam finals. And the US Slam finals, they're in teams of 4, they've travelled from all over the country. There's often a team captain who will tactically tell the poets where to put different poems to get the biggest impact. And partly because of the culture it's come out of there's a lot of socio-political messages, a lot of very intense poetry. So you will often come away from a slam feeling quite emotionally drained. And there'll be fantastic poetry, but it's really hard hitting. And also because they take it so seriously, poets will perform and then go back to the hotel and practice and want to put on the best performance the next time. Most poems will be exactly 3 minutes and 9 seconds long, so they can make the most of their performance time.
When I slammed in America, I went home every night and I just cried. Like, I just went home and sobbed every night. And it wasn't that I was sad as such, it was just like emotional release.
In contrast to that, at the German National Slams, one, in Germany you get a 7-minute time limit usually, because the language takes longer to say, but also the natural style there is more of a sort of funny storytelling style. And so people go to Poetry Slam for a good night out. And in amongst that, there's a very gentle, poignant poem that just smashes everyone, and it's amazing. But the National Slam there is pretty much the biggest party of the year for poets, because they all get to see each other and they hang out. And if you get knocked out, that just means you can go to other events and drink more beforehand and not worry about it. And so the culture around those two is very different.
One of the things that always freaks me out about traveling and slamming is the time differences, which is like a very literal thing, but it screws me a lot, because Australia, the first place I slammed was Perth, and it's 2 minutes there. And then I went to the National, which is Sydney Opera House, which is 2 minutes as well. So everyone's doing 2-minute poems. That's like, the winners are doing 2-minute poems, the losers are, it's just 2 minutes flat. No safety time, so it's like 2 minutes, then you get points off, which is pretty intense. And then I got here and it was like 3 minutes with a grace period. And I was like, you guys are so lazy. Like, just gonna have your cup of tea in the middle of your poem. But then I think the more I've been here, the more I've written 3-minute poems. Like my writing seemed to relax and expand, and I no longer have to say everything so fast to fit it into 2 minutes. And I realized that some of my 2-minute poems were actually like definitely 3-minute poems if I breathed and looked at people and maybe didn't choke on everything. But then when I went to America in March, they had a 1 minute, a 2 minute, a 3 minute, and a 4 minute round. And I was like, what? Like, what is that? So I had to write a 1 minute poem because I didn't have a 1 minute poem, and ended up doing like a 3 minute in the 4 minute. But everyone who slams in America regularly had it already. Like, they were like, yeah, I've got these options of 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s. And just that time difference thing I find really interesting.
Hi, I'm Lottie. Sorry, and I'm from Hackney. Well, I'm not actually from Hackney, I'm from Herefordshire. But I live in Hackney. I live just down the road in a warehouse. And I make my own jewellery. I've also got a blog, I'm a blogger. My blog's called Artisan is My Jam. So look me up if you want. I'm single, hi. Hi, fuck, sorry. And I'm going to do a poem. I don't really do poetry that much, but I'm a really big fan of Kate Tempest. So this is for her, I wrote it in an Uber. And, it's called You Said It Was Just a One Night Stand. And it's about someone that told me it was just a one night stand. And it goes exactly like this. You said it was a one night stand. I don't understand.
I would for sure say that across the country there's very different styles. The difference between Edinburgh and Glasgow is often commented on a lot in Scotland, There's a perception that Glasgow is a lot more fast-paced rap, especially in younger kind of men, and that Glasgow's more lyrical and more attention to words rather than, but then some people say that Edinburgh people are performers and Glasgow people are actual poets.
This is the example everyone's going to use because this is what we're so close to, but Glasgow poetry is a lot more like rap and fast-paced, and Edinburgh is a lot more, it's almost as if people in Edinburgh are less afraid to be like, this is my soul, look at it, which is really what I think is the most common style in Edinburgh, this really genuine soul-bearing, personal, even if it's political, through a personal lens.
There's quite a lot of regional variance. I mean, between Edinburgh and Glasgow even, there's quite a different style. Glasgow tends to be a little bit more hip-hop influenced, a little bit more rap. There's so many, especially younger male poets who do this really fast-paced, rapid-fire poetry, which is amazing. Whereas in Edinburgh, there's this stereotype that it's a lot of like love poems and really kind, and obviously that norm gets totally defied all the time. I mean, it's not just that cut and dry, but there are definitely regional styles.
I lived in Edinburgh for a while, and now I live in London, and there are obviously they are vastly different cities, and there's also a definite difference in my experience in the style of poetry, the style of performance, and the style of writing that you get at events in London or Edinburgh.
Generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that there are different poetry styles in different regions. Like in Scotland, there's like the big talk between Edinburgh and Glasgow, but I mean, I know that there's differences between, say, like Cambridge University and London, just in general. Like I know that there's differences between the different regions generally speaking, but I think you can find pretty much whatever you're looking for in each region as well. Like you'll find more kind of rap style stuff in Edinburgh. You can find really lyrical, classical style poetry in Glasgow. Like it's not, there's not like a big wall put up around each region saying that you must perform poetry this way. I just think that generally speaking, like you kind of get that kind of general regional sort of style appearing, but I don't think it's like a hard, fast rule.
On the days that I remember that I am black, this city's police siren heartbeat turns into a threat. I wear fair-skinned tight, hoping it can mask my melanin, and every bag they clutch closer to their chest is a gut punch, and I'm struggling to breathe like he did. On the days that I remember that I am black, every hashtag hacks away at me. Every tweet in sympathy is a reminder that I do not share their privilege, whilst every tweet in anger is a call to action, and I'm reminded that I do not act. I have been called Oreo more times than I have been called nigger. I have been told you don't seem that black more times than I've been to Africa, or more times than I've been to the Caribbean. I have more white relatives than black relatives, and whilst we may not share blood, my mouth doesn't reject calling them auntie or uncle like it does my dad's siblings.
Poetic styles definitely change depending where they are in the country. Hammer and Tongue is based in 6 different cities, and when we have the national final at the Royal Albert Hall, you can really tell. You don't need to hear this person is from Bristol or Cambridge. You can hear it because it's been influenced often by the people who are running that particular slam. And so I do think there's a huge difference, and that's really good, really good.
Places where there are, for example, a Hammer and Tongue, you will find more slam poets coming from that area, region, whatever, so Brighton, Cambridge, wherever. In Norwich, there's a third, of course, type of poetry, from slamming to performance poetry, what I do, and then there's people who get up and they read. It's a poetry reading, and it's don't clap at the end of the poem and all of this, and it's all very serious. So, I think there's 3 different types, and it depends who's running the nights and how those nights are getting on, and so on and so forth. And that will vary from time to time as well.
I am acutely conscious of the fact that I tend to have quite a limited knowledge of how poetry in general and how slam poetry particularly is done elsewhere. I'm constantly bumping up against the limits of my own awareness and finding out that I need to stretch myself. So to try and combat that, I've become as voracious as I possibly can in consuming other people's nights, other people's events, and other people's work, and trying to cast myself as far afield as I possibly can. But even that is very, very confined to the London scene at the moment, just because I live here. I hear from friends and I hear from old colleagues about stuff that's happening elsewhere. My own home city of Birmingham, I'm told, has quite a good burgeoning slam and open mic scene, but I haven't had a chance to sample any of it yet.
To be honest, I haven't seen different styles in different areas. I've seen a variety of style in all areas, but I haven't seen much of a difference in terms of regional styles yet. Maybe I will.
You know, I've been part of this scene longer than any of these people. And back then it meant something, you know? Like, back when Kate Tempest was Kate Inclement Weather. Real poetry. But I thought it was about time I broke my silence. So I brought it all. My collected works. Not in a pamphlet! Because everyone knows real art is a struggle to appreciate. This poem is called Slam Piece in the Key of D Minor, entitled This Is World Wars Who I Good Question You. Or In Defense of the Color Bled, which is like blue but also like red, but not like that son of a bitch purple, who stole my keys on the 18th of October 1995 and melted them down into government conspiracies. I know you're watching.
Poetry styles change with location in the same way that like visual art changes from location to location, music changes from location to location. Obviously because it's like a language-based thing, a lot of it's about like slang and rhythm and like accent. The classic example is like poetry around London changes so much, and then if you take that out of London, in Scotland, like there's a little thing between Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's obviously like Cambridge, Oxford, there's like Exeter, and each of these cities tend to have their own scene and tend to have their own issues and subjects that maybe get talked about more, talked about less, and ways of doing it. So yeah, poetry definitely changes with each location, and obviously slams change in each location as well.
I come from Bath and the Bristol area, and so being up in Edinburgh, like I've seen three major different types of poetry aside from all the stuff I've watched on YouTube. Bath poetry is very beautiful, very lyrical, a lot of stuff to do with like mental health and sexual identity. Bristol poetry, it's more about storytelling and sort of like presenting a character, and then Edinburgh poetry is just, well, it's mainly phenomenal. But it's a lot to do with, again, storytelling, again, like taking the reader on a journey. And I've heard from, you know, that Glasgow has a lot of sort of rap and just fast-paced poetry, which I want to check out. So I think, yeah, it's definitely safe to say that different areas have different forms of poetry, yeah.
Everything's different place to place in some way. Like even accents and like slang plays a big part on the fact that means poetry will always be different city to city. Meanings of stuff is different. So places have, I don't think in London you don't, I think everyone talks about London style, but actually if you go to open mics, there's so much different because it's just such a big place. But when I was in Edinburgh, I noticed that a lot of the poets from different cities, like smaller cities, sound like a lot more like each other because they're close-knit communities. So you get whole batches of poets in London who start to sound really like each other, because that's a community thing. And when you're writing with someone and you go to events with someone, yeah, I think it affects people. And obviously in smaller cities, those scenes are much smaller, which means you're always with the same people, which means you always go to the same events. So yeah, definitely city to city is very different.
I think that poets do have to do a lot of work to try and make sure that they don't all just become the same and all just write the same poem again and again and again. Having gone down to Unislam at the beginning of the year, there was a huge difference between different universities and different areas of Britain. I think that it very much depends on the city you're in, because I think that slam poetry and poetry slams are very much a city thing at the moment, because there's not enough people in the countryside who write and perform poetry to get them going. So it's very much influenced by the city you live in. So people who live in cities where there's a huge problem with something like sexism are more likely to have that kind of thing going on in their poetry, whereas people who live in Edinburgh, I think, are often trying to write about the fact that it's a city of literature and something like that. So loads of people will write poems about Edinburgh.
Going to Unislam, I felt almost in a position of privilege, seeing kind of a lot of these different styles from across, a lot of these different poets from across the UK, and a lot of them it didn't have the same diversity. It didn't have the diversity that I expected, because a lot of them, I mean, there were kind of Londoners at other unis and people from everywhere in these uni teams, but it seemed kind of outside the London scene. There's a strong US influence, which it was weird though, because with my experience with the Words First program, where they had poetry workshops taking place in like 6 different cities in the UK, including London, there was a very big diversity of voices. The Edinburgh Words First lot and the Edinburgh Unislam team were very, very different stylistically, and I thought, ooh, this is interesting. The Edinburgh team was the Unislam team from Edinburgh felt to me anyway very, very American influence. They had kind of the team poem, or the kind of the pair poem with the very, very strong expressive voices. But then the Edinburgh Words First set were very you could tell that they were kind of Scottish. So I don't know, I think maybe that's just kind of the thing that slam lends itself to. It lends itself to taking influences from other places, and again, the people were very different.
I miss every inch of you. I miss the Saturday nights and the Monday mornings. I miss the panic and the weather warnings, because less than an inch of snow is forming.
I miss Taco Tuesdays in downtown. I miss the 101 northbound and 4-way intersections that aren't round.
I miss the late trains and the early buses, the lunchtime rushes on 12-hour shifts with co-workers who don't give a shit, just like me.
I miss wide roads and carpool lanes, and how people weave in and out of carpool lanes because no one understands the laws about carpool lanes.
I miss the pigeons.
I miss legal marijuana.
I miss the friendly people that try to feed the pigeons.
I miss the friendly people who sell me legal marijuana.
I miss the over-friendly people that try to eat the pigeons.
I miss the over-friendly me when I smoke legal marijuana.
Poetry definitely does change from place to place, even within this country. So, for example, any local event that's happened, any kind of local feeling about, say, for example, budget cuts in the local community, that will have a really huge impact on the local poetry of that scene, which may not be felt in other places in the country. And also at the same time, so I'm from London originally, and a lot of people are starting to feel kind of disenfranchised with the politics of London at the moment and the London centrism of the country. And so it's really interesting to get out of London and see poetry nights from elsewhere and how those people are reacting to what's going on in the world.
I think London poetry slams, I guess there does tend to be quite a lot of political poetry. Personally, I view that as a good thing. I guess if there is a sort of stereotype of slams, it would be that London poetry slams do tend to be quite political, I guess. I think that people will sort of choose to put across their most political poetry for a slam. They think, oh, that will slam better, rather than the poem they've written about their ex, or the heartbreak, or the funny one. So I guess the majority of slams I have been to, people do tend to put forward their more political stuff.
London's got a very, very particular kind of culture of its own within the UK. And that's reflected a lot in the poetry that comes out. And I think of all the, maybe it's just because I'm most familiar with the London scene, but it's also where I found the most diversity of voices and the greatest diversity of styles. Because you've got people taking influence from hip hop, grime, jazz, R&B, traditional page poetry, people that have come from other parts of the world and they're taking influences from the classical styles or wherever they came from, or whatever kind of more contemporary stuff is going on there.
I think it's interesting that there are kind of variations within London, both that I've kind of been told about, but also that, you know, different nights will have different vibes and different things that are encouraged, and yeah, there is definitely an American slam style, which I think I saw a lot of on YouTube before I ever came to a slam. And I think that's probably where the confusion came from about thinking that, not knowing that slam was a competitive thing, was just they all had, you know, this person performs as poet at such and such a slam. And I was like, okay, slam is just a poetry night. So yeah, I think there are variations, but I probably couldn't talk too much about them.
London slam is like very rap based, I feel. It's like really hip hop influenced. You also get more comedy than I've seen anywhere else in slam culture. Even like Australia doesn't use comedy that much. So yeah, the slam styles are incredibly different. But I think the best thing is that you can come from any of those cultures, like any of those slam cultures, and you can bring whatever you've got, and I think it will have a place. And it might not be a place that scores well, or it might not be a place that everyone loves or remembers, but it's a place that will, like, it'll exist there. And people will still like cheer you and clap you and maybe talk to you about it. And whether you score well or not, like, slam is a place where you can say anything in any way you want. And there's a real power to that, I think.